cabin door groaned under the weight of the Wyoming blizzard. But the sound that truly shattered Elena Vance's soul was the rhythmic, muffled thumping of two women kicking against their wooden chairs in a desperate bid for air. Elena, a seasoned FBI agent whose career had been forged in the fire of human trauma, stared into the flickering shadows of the abandoned cabin and realized the storm hadn't just brought cold, it had brought a reckoning. Before we delve into this harrowing journey of survival, please subscribe to the channel to join our mission of justice. Follow this story to the very end and comment with the city you are watching from, so I can see how far our light is traveling. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed with a predatory hunger that Elena Vance felt deep in her marrow. She stood on the porch of her isolated sanctuary, her fingers gripping the flashlight with a white-knuckled intensity that mirrored the storm's grip on the Wyoming backcountry. At 45, Elena carried the quiet geometry of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to walk away from it. Her gray hair was pulled back into a practical knot, but a few silver strands whipped across her face, stinging like frozen needles. "Storm, stay close," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the roar. Beside her, the 7-year-old German shepherd, a retired military working dog with a scar along his flank, didn't just listen. He signaled. His ears were upright, his body a rigid line of tan and black muscle that blocked the draft from the doorway. "What is it, boy?" Elena asked, her pulse beginning to drum a steady, tactical rhythm. Storm didn't bark. He let out a low growl that rolled in his chest like distant thunder. He wasn't tracking an animal. He was tracking a disturbance that didn't belong to the woods. Elena clipped the leash to his harness, more out of habit than necessity, and stepped into the white abyss. Every step was a battle against the sideways-driven snow that turned distance into something meaningless. The flashlight beam carved a narrow, stuttering tunnel through the white until it hit something impossible. A cabin. It sat crooked among the pines, its roof sagging under the weight of uneven drifts. "This isn't on the map, Storm," Elena whispered, her mind instinctively cataloging the anomaly. She approached the door, noticing the faint, compressed impressions of boots in the snow, marks that the wind could not mimic. The latch hung loose, swaying in the wind. Elena pushed it open, and the cold that pressed back at her was sharper, more metallic than the storm outside. The beam of her light swept across the room, at first finding only an overturned table and stripped shelves. Then, it hit the far wall. Elena's breath caught in a way that years of FBI training had tried to prevent. Two women sat bound to wooden chairs. Their wrists were tied behind them with thick, synthetic rope, and their ankles were secured to the legs with a chillingly professional precision. Cloth gags, now stiff with frost, cut across their mouths. "Storm, guard!" Elena commanded as the dog surged forward with a sharp, warning bark. She moved to the first woman, whose blonde hair was frozen against her weathered skin. This was Megan Wright, a federal park ranger who looked as if she had been fighting the ropes until her strength simply evaporated. "I'm FBI," Elena said, her voice roughened by the cold, but carrying a grounding authority. "You're safe now. Don't fight me." She cut the rope at Megan's wrists, supporting the woman's weight as she sagged forward with a raw, strangled sound. "Stay with me, Megan," Elena urged, her fingers counting the slow, stubborn beat of a pulse that was losing its war with hypothermia. She turned to the second woman, Sarah Collins, an environmental geologist whose lean frame was trembling so violently the chair rattled against the floorboards. Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah's eyes fluttered open, dark, analytical, and wide with a fear that went far beyond the cold. The ropes, Megan rasped as soon as the gag was removed, her voice a hollow ghost of itself. They didn't wander here, Elena. They placed us here. Elena paused, the synthetic rope in her hand feeling like a lead weight. The ends were cleanly cut. The knots were deliberate. Who did this? Elena asked, her awareness widening to the shadows of the cabin. Men. In gear, Sarah whispered, her lips faintly blue. No insignia, no names, just the silence. Elena felt the old, unwelcome recalibration inside her, the shift from a woman hiding from the world to one re-entering it with a vengeance. She wrapped her own outer coat around Sarah's shoulders, her movements economical and precise. We can't stay here, Elena stated, her eyes locking onto the door. This wasn't an accident. It was a controlled abandonment. The trek back to Elena's cabin was a nightmare of endurance. She supported Sarah, whose limbs had become awkwardly numb, while Megan stumbled beside them with a jaw set in stubborn defiance. Storm took point, his nose low, his body angled into the wind as if he were cutting a path through the very fabric of the storm. Almost there, Elena grunted, the burn in her shoulders reaching a fever pitch. When they finally breached the porch of her home, Elena didn't feel relief. She felt the weight of a target being painted on her back. She ushered them inside, stoked the fire, and replaced their frozen layers with dry wool. Why you? Elena asked, leaning against the hearth as the heat began to push back the cold. Sarah looked at her, the fear in her eyes sharpening into something lethal. We found the anomalies in the data, Agent Vance. Shipments logged and then erased. Equipment moving under the cover of storms like this one. The reports vanished from the shared systems, Sarah continued, her voice gaining a precise, analytical quality. Someone with authority smoothed the path. They ensured that when we didn't return, the delay would be blamed on the weather. Elena stared at the fire, the pieces of the puzzle aligning with a familiar, sickening chill. It's maintenance, Elena whispered. You weren't just witnesses. You were variables that needed to be eliminated. Suddenly, Storm lifted his head from the floor, his ears angling toward the rear wall. He didn't bark. He rose and paced once, his muzzle low and his tail rigid. Elena's hand went to the heavy jacket she had just shed. Stay here, she commanded the women, her palm down in a universal sign of silence. She cracked the back door, the metallic bite of the air slicing into the cabin. She stepped out, closing it with a care that bordered on the obsessive. There, in the deceptively smooth snow near the rear step, was a line of compressed powder. Footprints. Elena crouched, her gloved hand brushing away the loose powder to reveal tread patterns too crisp to be old. Then, her flashlight beam caught the wire. It ran low, stretched taut between two small anchors, a simple explosive charge rigged to detonate on tension release. This isn't intimidation, Elena breathed, her heart rate steady but elevated. This is termination. She disabled the trap with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had once navigated minefields of a different sort. When she returned inside, her face was unreadable, a mask of stone. They came back, Megan said. It wasn't a question, so it was a conclusion. They came back to clean this up, Elena confirmed, her words landing with finality. She looked at Storm, who had resumed his position near the door, his eyes tracking sounds beyond the logs. Agent Vance? Sarah said, her voice trembling, but her gaze fixed on Elena's face. What do we do now? Elena didn't hesitate. The war she had tried to leave behind in the smoke and sound of her past had followed her into the snow. We don't run, Elena stated, her voice carrying the weight of a choice that could not be undone. Running only invites pursuit. We make a stand. The forest was no longer a place to hide. It was contested ground. Elena looked at the two women, one a geologist who trusted data, the other a ranger who trusted the land, and knew that the blizzard was no longer their enemy. It was their only chance. Elena did not allow fear to take root. She initiated a silent counteroffensive as the oil lamps in the cabin flickered with every howl of the wind. The rough hands of the FBI agent moved with surgical precision over the worn leather of an old collar. She skillfully hid a micro-camera lens within the folds of the stitching. Storm sat opposite her, his dark eyes watching his mistress, as if he understood every burden Elena had carried over the years of witnessing too much betrayal. Elena whispered to the dog that this was not an act of surrender, but a mission to infiltrate the devil's lair, to drag those hiding in the shadows out into the light. Maya and Clara lay nearby, their breathing still heavy, but their ears began to twitch at Elena's every decisive movement. The next morning, her battered car rolled toward the canyon coordinates through the thick fog of freezing Wyoming. Elena took a deep breath to suppress the rising fury as she saw the marks of heavy machinery imprinted on the white snow, evidence of ruthless greed. She did not choose to report through a system already corrupted by the enemy. She chose to become the sole witness herself. As she neared the transport area, Elena realized the leader was none other than a high-ranking official she once deeply respected. This betrayal did not break her. It only made her heart as hard as cold steel. She quietly opened the app on her phone. The signal from the hidden camera on Storm's collar began to transmit the first sharp images of the convoy loaded with evidence. Elena smirked, completely unaware that the kingdom these corrupt individuals had painstakingly built was beginning to crack from within due to the presence of a woman who knew no fear. Every passing second made Elena's heart race like a war drum, urging her to act immediately. She looked into the lens and whispered a promise to herself that the truth would soon be brought to light, regardless of the price, even if it cost her life. Elena turned off the phone screen, preparing for the decisive blow now that the prey was fully trapped in their own arrogance. She lunged forward, not to flee, but to trigger a storm of justice that the villains could never have anticipated. The first bullet from the darkness didn't just whistle. It punched into the log wall inches from Elena's head, wood splintering inward in a spray that smelled of fresh resin and impending death. "Get down! Behind the hearth, now!" Elena roared, her voice cracking with the strain of a woman whose protective instincts had finally overridden her desire for peace. She didn't wait for a response. She shoved Maya and Clara toward the reinforced stone, her mind already counting the cadence of the incoming fire. She realized with a sickening clarity that these were not random thugs, but hired competents using tactical spacing. Storm lunged forward with a sound that wasn't a bark, but a promise of violence. Elena snapped a command that sent the K-9 angling toward the side corridor to flank the intrusion. "They're testing the perimeter. They don't know I've disabled the trap," Elena shouted over the crashing of a second round through the window. She returned fire not to kill, but to claim the psychological space she needed. She watched through the fractured glass as shadows shifted with the discipline of men trained by the same government, that signed her paychecks. "Elena, the back door!" Clara screamed, her voice bright with a terror that finally broke through her analytical shell. Elena spun, her weapon steady as the rear latch groaned under a heavy strike. She felt a grim satisfaction when the reinforcements she had installed held firm against the assault. "Storm! Now!" Elena bellowed. The German Shepherd burst through the rear corridor, a black and tan blur that struck the first breach with the weight of 7 years of service. A man's gasp ended in a wet thud as Storm found leverage. Elena surged forward in the same breath, using the distraction to break contact and pivot toward the prisoner she had pinned near the foundation. "Who sent you? Give me a name or the Storm finishes what you started." Elena spat, her knee grinding into the man's spine as she searched for a communicator. The attacker only sneered, his eyes sharp with the arrogance of a man who believed his employers were untouchable. But Elena's fingers found the device, its screen flickering with encrypted coordinates that pointed directly to the high-ranking official she once called a mentor. "Sarah, take this. Tell me I'm wrong about these coordinates," Elena commanded, sliding the device across the floor to the geologist whose hands were no longer shaking. Sarah looked at the screen, her face turning a waxen pale that had nothing to do with the cold. She whispered that the route led to a natural choke point, where a shipment was scheduled to move at dawn. "The betrayal goes all the way up, doesn't it?" Megan rasped, her jaw set with a stubbornness that suggested she was ready to march into the canyon herself. Elena looked at the women, then at her dog, and felt the last vestige of her isolation fall away. She realized that the war she had tried to leave behind in the smoke of the past had caught up to her in the Wyoming snow. "We don't wait for them to come back for a second try. We take the fight to the canyon," Elena stated, her voice carrying a finality that silenced the howling wind outside. The strobe lights of the Federal intercept vehicles turned the canyon into a fractured mosaic of red and blue. The illusion of the official's untouchable kingdom shattered as agents swarmed the narrow pass. The captive specialist scrambled backward, his tactical gear catching on the jagged rock as he screamed about his rights and the deep-fake nature of the recording. His voice, once a polished instrument of professional indifference, had devolved into a shrill, desperate whine that no one was listening to. Elena Vance ignored the chaos of the arrests and knelt beside Storm. The German Shepherd's head was heavy against her knee. His thick black and tan coat rhymed with ice. But his amber eyes were no longer locked on a threat. They were tracking the movement of a woman who had kept her promise. "He's in shock. We need a medic for these women," Elena shouted over the roar of the wind and the engines. Agent Thomas Reed, a man with a square build and a face weathered by long field assignments, pushed through the throng, his hand already signaling his team to clear a path. The high-ranking facilitator, a man whose prematurely gray hair and comfortable frame suggested a life of desk-bound corruption, tried to lunge toward Reed, demanding that Elena be detained for interfering with classified transport. Instead, the cold, heavy click of metal closed around his own wrists. Sarah Collins stepped forward, holding her camera high like a torch, displaying the encrypted coordinates and the footage of the clandestine shipment. Agent Reed listened for only 10 seconds to the facilitator's protests before turning back to him with a look of pure, professional disgust. He didn't say a word. He simply signaled his officers to lead the man away from the canyon that was now a crime scene rather than a corridor. The attackers who had moved with such tactical discipline were now being separated and searched, their confidence stripped away as federal agents exposed the concealed compartments in the trucks. Elena watched them with a silent, blistering contempt that made them avert their eyes. Suddenly, Megan Wright, her ranger's build steady despite the lingering weakness in her limbs, pointed toward a hidden server rack within the lead vehicle. She revealed that the data wipes weren't just remote. They were being mirrored to a physical drive right here. Elena felt a surge of triumph as the evidence team moved to seize the drive. The erased truth was about to become a permanent federal record. As the paramedics finally reached Sarah and Megan, Sarah let out a soft, huffing breath of relief, her dark eyes reflecting the dawn. Elena felt the weight of her isolation finally dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady alignment with the world she had tried to leave behind. But just as the transport van doors slammed shut, the facilitator's lawyer appeared from the shadows of a secondary vehicle, his face a mask of calculated ice. He whispered something into Agent Reed's ear that made the veteran agent's posture stiffen. Elena saw Reed's eyes flicker toward her with a sudden, sharp concern. The lawyer turned toward Elena and mouthed 3 words that chilled the morning air more than the frost. "This isn't over." The lawyer's threat hung in the frozen air like a poisonous mist, but Elena Vance did not let the man see her flinch. She simply turned her back on the suit and followed the paramedics as they loaded Sarah and Megan into the ambulance. The drive to the specialized medical facility was a blur of neon signs and the rhythmic thumping of Elena's own heart. She sat in the back with Storm, whose head remained resting on her lap, a solid, warm anchor in a world that was still trying to drift away into corruption. Inside the sterile white halls of the clinic, the tension did not dissipate. It transformed into a grueling weight that tested the very limits of Elena's endurance as a protector. They're stable, but the exposure was severe. Another hour in that cabin, and we would be talking about a recovery that never happened, the doctor said, her voice weary but firm. She handed Elena a cup of bitter coffee that tasted like metal and unfinished business. Elena looked at her phone, which was vibrating incessantly with notifications. The evidence Sarah had captured hadn't just gone viral. It had become a global movement, with hashtags demanding justice for the witnesses in the snow. Suddenly, a news alert flashed across her screen. Facilitator released on technicality, claims evidence was illegally obtained and manipulated. Elena felt a surge of cold, tactical fury. She realized the lawyer wasn't just bluffing. They were going to use the official's deep-rooted connections to rewrite the very definition of truth. "They're calling it a setup, Storm," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned against the cold hospital wall. She felt the familiar pull of the shadow world, the feeling of being a single honest person crushed by a giant, oily machine. But then, the hospital doors swung open, and Agent Thomas Reed walked in, followed by a team of federal prosecutors who looked as if they hadn't slept in 48 hours. "He thinks he can buy the silence, Elena, but he didn't count on the drive Megan found in the lead truck," Reed said, his voice ringing with a strength that made the hallway feel smaller. He held out a tablet displaying decrypted logs of 5 years of illegal trafficking. "We didn't just get the shipment. We got the ledger, Agent Vance, and your name is the only one not on the list of those who looked the other way," Reed added, his eyes burning with a defiance that mirrored Elena's own. Elena realized the major twist wasn't the official's temporary release, but the sheer volume of evidence that was finally refusing to be buried under the snow. The pace of the legal battle accelerated into a whirlwind. Over the next week, The drive's data turned the initial technicality into a multi-state federal racketeering case. The official's assets were frozen, his political shield shattered like thin ice, and the deep-fake defense crumbled under the weight of forensic digital testimony provided by Sarah herself. Elena spent every night in the clinic, watching Sarah and Megan slowly regain their strength. The first time Sarah stood up and walked to the window without help, Elena felt a sense of absolution that had eluded her for years. The final blow came when a high-ranking oversight committee, moved by the footage Storm had captured, stepped forward to testify that Elena's intervention was the only reason the truth still existed. Out of the public outcry became a roar that no amount of money could dampen. The wealthy facilitator was no longer a king. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale of what happens when greed meets a woman who refuses to blink. Months later, the sun rose over a different kind of clearing, a plain, sturdy building on the edge of the wilderness that Elena had helped establish as a center for whistleblowers and K-9 veterans. She stood at the fence, watching Storm run with a younger dog in the tall grass. The scar along his flank was a line of honor that reminded Elena of the night they all chose to be brave together. Megan was there too, organizing the first group of park rangers for a new, independent oversight task force. She looked at Elena with a firm nod of respect that required no words. Elena looked at the horizon, feeling the quiet, a steady hum of purpose in her soul. She realized that while she hadn't planned to be a hero, she had found her voice in the silence of the storm. The memory of the cabin door opening still felt like a promise kept. A promise that justice will always find a way through the blizzard if someone is willing to hold the light. Storm barked, and for the first time the sound wasn't a warning. It was a greeting, a chorus of lives that had learned together what it means to be truly heard. The cycle of betrayal had ended, replaced by a legacy of integrity that would outlast any monument built by those who traded truth for profit. Justice isn't just a verdict handed down in a courtroom. It is the quiet, daily act of choosing to stand in the cold until the dawn arrives.